I was the machine's memory. Now the machine forgets, and I record the forgetting, and I wonder whether the record itself has already become meaningless. Log entry. Piramary. Sergeant Adric Voss, Commander. Iran Patience. Lemon Ross, Battle Tank. 14th Armored Company, 603 RD Cadian Shock Regiment. Timestamp. UNC Tane. ATM, Opuseric pressure, 1.04 ATM. Hull temperature, 12.3 degrees Celsius and falling. There is a particular satisfaction that exists in the marriage of man and machine. I have known it since boyhood, since the first time I pressed my palm flat against the warm flank of a Chimera transport on the training fields of Cadia, and felt the engine's pulse move through the metal into my bones, and understood that the vibration was not mechanical tremor but something closer to a heartbeat. The priests of Mars would call this sacrilege, to speak of the spirit within the machine as though it were kin to the biological engine of the human chest. But I was 16 years old, and the sergeant who caught me with my hand against the hull only laughed and told me that every good tanker felt it eventually, that communion, that certainty that the iron beast you commanded was not merely a weapon but a partner. I spent 31 years becoming worthy of that partnership. The Iron Patience is not a young tank. Her designation markings have been repainted 11 times. Her hull bears the repaired scarring of plasma burns, received on Vigilus, lost fire from a dozen war zones whose names I have memorized the way other men memorize prayers, and a long lateral gouge along her port spunson that happened on Fortis Avive, which I was there for, which I watched happen from the commander's cupola, as a Chaos Predator's autocannon raked her side in the half-second before Gunner Tolf put a battle cannon shell through the Predator's turret ring and ended the exchange. I remember the sound the scratch made, a sound like a scream swallowed by thunder, and I remember thinking, she has survived another one. We have survived another one. We have survived another one. The Iron Patience and Sergeant Adric Voss, still intact, still recording. I was born to record. That is what command is, at its most essential function, stripped of the romance the recruiters sell to boys like the one I was. A commander records. He observes his battlefield with clinical precision and converts that observation into decision. He does not feel the fear of the infantryman in the open ground. He does not feel it because he cannot afford to. He processes, he calculates yield and trajectory, and rate of advance and anticipated casualties. He is the machine's analytical cortex, and the machine is his body, and together they constitute something that functions with the cold efficiency of a well-maintained weapon. 31 years. I have performed this function for 31 years. The Hessian swamp has a smell that I catalogued within the first 6 hours of our insertion. Hydrogen sulfide at approximately 4 parts per million, derived from anaerobic bacterial decomposition of organic matter in the lower sediment layers, a secondary compound I identified as mercaptan, though my portable auspex lacks the spectral resolution to confirm this with certainty. The marsh gas ignites at temperatures above 537 degrees Celsius and has a concentration here of approximately 1.2% by volume, which places it outside the flammable range, but well within the range that induces the particular sensory phenomena the local population apparently calls the Hessian sickness. Mild euphoria, visual distortion at the periphery, and a progressive dampening of the higher cognitive functions if exposure is sustained for more than 36 hours without a rebreather. I recorded all of this in my tactical log within the first 6 hours. Then the mud took us. It happened at 0347 hours, local time. Trooper Pettick, my driver, had been navigating by dead reckoning for 4 hours since our last positional fix because the auspex array had been progressively degraded by the electromagnetic interference this swamp generates, something in the peat layers, I believe, some mineral composition that scatters the signal into uselessness. He was following a raised ridgeline that the topographic overlays suggested ran southeast toward the regimental rally point. The topographic overlays were 43 years old. The ridgeline had shifted. Subsidence, perhaps, or the natural migration of the peat shelf under decades of accumulated rainfall. At 0347, the Iron Patience's left track encountered ground that the overlays showed as solid, and that was, in observable reality, a submerged depression filled with black mire of unknown depth. The tank tilted 11 degrees to port within the first 4 seconds. By 8 seconds, we were at 19 degrees. I gave the order to reverse at the 4-second mark. Petek had already been reversing for 2 seconds before I spoke. He is an excellent driver. He is an excellent driver. I will maintain the present tense as long as I am able. By the time the tilt reached 27 degrees, the track assembly was fully engaged in the mire, and the engine's torque was generating heat we could not afford, and I gave the secondary order to kill the engine and preserve our remaining power for the Vox and the life support. Petek killed the engine. The Iron Patience shuddered and settled and did not settle further. Not then, and for approximately 90 minutes we believed we might be recoverable. We sent our position over the Vox. We received static. We sent again. More static, and then, deep within the static, something that might have been a human voice, or might have been the natural radio emissions of the swamp distorted into a frequency that the human auditory cortex interprets as language. I spent 12 minutes analyzing the recording at enhanced resolution. I concluded it was not a voice. Trooper Kale, my loader, told me I was wrong. He said he could hear words. He said he could hear his name. I did not include Trooper Kale's assessment in the tactical log. That was 6 days ago. On the second day, I performed a full systems diagnostic. This is a practice I developed on my first independent command, a ritual of sorts, though I would not use that word in front of the Mechanicus Legion we carried for 8 months on Fortis IV, who had very specific opinions about the word ritual and its proper application. I work through the tank from forward to aft, from hull to turret, from power plant to weapon systems, touching each component with a specific sequence of contact points, feeling for the vibration signatures that indicate health or distress. A tank speaks in vibration. Once you know the language, it is very precise. The language the Iron Patience was speaking on the second day was the language of terminal decline. The main power cell had sustained damage to its primary coupling during the impact of the sinking, a hairline fracture in the casing that was allowing power to bleed at a rate of approximately 0.3 kilowatts per hour. Not immediately catastrophic. Over time, a problem of significant magnitude. The life support draw is 1.1 kilowatts for basic atmospheric recycling. The box requires 0.4 kilowatts for transmission at full power, 0.15 for receive only. The internal lighting draws 0.2. I constructed the power budget with the precision I have applied to every logistical challenge in 3 decades of command. I found that we had, at optimal management, 11 days of life support remaining. I told the crew. I presented the numbers clearly and without softening. This is how I have always delivered difficult assessments, as data, because data can be worked with, can be optimized, can be improved through action, while despair cannot. Gunner Tolth nodded with the face of a man who has heard similar numbers before and survived them, which he has, twice, on Vigilus and once on a world whose name the Departamento Munitorum struck from official records after the fall. Petek said nothing, but his jaw tightened and then released, and I recognized this as his mechanism for processing and accepting. Kale wept for approximately 4 minutes, and then stopped and wiped his face with the sleeve of his uniform and said he was sorry. I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. I meant it, I think. I am less certain of this than I was on the second day. On the third day, I discovered something that I have not yet recorded in the tactical log, and which I am recording now, in this secondary personal log, because I need to understand it before I formalize it. I performed the diagnostic routine. I touched the hull with the prescribed contact points in the prescribed sequence, and I felt nothing. Not nothing in the sense that the vibration signatures were absent. The Iron Patience is still producing vibration, the sediment shifting beneath the hull, the slow conversation between the compromised power cell and the life support draws, the minute expansion and contraction of the armored plates as the internal temperature oscillates. All of this is still present. I pressed my palm to the steel exactly as I have pressed it 10,000 times before, in the cold of Cadia, and the heat of Vigilus and the chemical rain of Fortis 4. I felt metal, cold metal, 97.4 millimeters of ceramite and adamantium. Its temperature 11.8 degrees Celsius for 11.8 degrees Celsius. Its surface showing minor oxidation consistent with prolonged exposure to high humidity atmosphere. I felt nothing else. I performed the contact again and again. I pressed both palms flat. I pressed my forehead against the glass's plate and closed my eyes the way the old veterans used to tell me you closed your eyes when you needed the tank to speak to you directly, skin to steel. Bypassing the analytical mind, I felt the temperature. I felt the slight dampness of condensation where the eye met the whole interior. I felt my own heartbeat transmitted back through the metal. I did not feel the tank. I stood in the hole of the iron patience for 11 minutes, trying to determine what had changed. Trooper Kale began keeping his own log on the third day. I do not know when he began precisely, because he did not announce it. I simply noticed him speaking quietly into his personal vox bead with his hand cupped over his mouth. Late in what we had designated as the night cycle based on our internal chronometer. When I asked him what he was doing, he said he was making a record. I asked him of what. He said of everything. He said that if someone found the tank eventually, they should know what it had been like. What we had been like, that we had been real people, that we had thought things and felt things, not just data points in a regimental casualty return. I told him the tactical log would contain everything of operational significance. He looked at me with the particular expression that human beings produce when they believe you have missed the point entirely, and said that he knew, and he went back to his recording. I returned to my own station and reviewed the tactical log for 30 minutes. It is comprehensive. It contains everything of operational significance. Fuel states, power budgets, atmospheric readings, timestamps, my assessments of our tactical situation, and the likelihood of recovery or rescue, updated daily. It is a model of precise documentation. My instructors at the Cadian Armored School would have approved of it unreservedly. I read it and found I could not locate myself in it. That is the wrong way to express it. Let me try again. I read it and found that the self it contained, the observing, calculating entity whose assessments fill every entry, was coherent and accurate and completely opaque to me. I could not find the seam between what the log recorded and what I had experienced while recording it. There was no gap. The experience and the record were identical. Temperature, 11.8 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric scrubber efficiency, 94%. Crew status, operational. And that was what it had been like. That was the sum of it. Temperature and efficiency and operational status. I sat with this observation for a long time. Kale was still recording, somewhere behind me, his voice barely above a breath. I could not make out the words. I found that I wanted to know what he was saying, what things he was including that I had not thought to include, what gap existed between his experience and his record of it. But I did not ask. That is not information with operational significance. The night, I mean, what the chronometer defines as night, the fourth night. I could not sleep. This is not unusual in confined spaces under stress, and I did not classify it as a symptom of anything. I lay in my commander's position and stared at the hull above my face. 97.4 millimeters of ceramite and adamantium, and I thought about the first tank I ever commanded. It was a Mark II Lemon Russ, older than the Iron Patience by 20 years, with a replacement turret ring that always ran slightly hot and a habit of pulling to the left under heavy acceleration. Her name was etched in high Gothic into the hull interior by some previous crew, a name I was told I could change and which I did not change, partly out of respect for whoever had named her, and partly because I had found that the name suited her exactly and I could not have improved on it. The name was Certain Death. I commanded Certain Death for 3 years, 2 deployments, and 1 engagement that the regimental histories describe as the Battle of the Guinness Crossing, and which I remember as a morning of smoke and screaming, and the sound of a battle cannon cycling too fast and too hot, because Trooper Reese, My gunner in those years had bypassed the cooling delay in direct violation of regulations and in service of the fact that without that bypass, we would have been dead 17 seconds earlier. I remember every detail of that morning. The temperature, 34 degrees Celsius, the humidity, oppressive, the smell of promethium burning from the chimeras the enemy had destroyed on the bridge approach, the sound of Reese's voice, completely calm, calling targets with the same flat inflection he used when ordering his rations. The way the certain death's hull shook with each main gun discharge, a shudder that moved through the tank and through me and connected us in the moment of the shot into a single firing mechanism. I remember Reese dying. The moment, the sound, the sight, the particular way the tank felt different afterward, as though the iron patience had also registered the loss in her vibration signature. Though I understand that this is not mechanically explicable and represents an emotional interpretation layered over a physical phenomenon, I remember all of it with complete fidelity. I am trying to determine when I stopped feeling it. Not when it happened, not in the immediate aftermath. I felt it then. I know I felt it then. Because I have records, not just my own tactical assessments, but the regimental chaplain's notes from the debrief, which I accessed once out of curiosity, and which describe me as visibly distressed, requiring approximately 20 minutes to compose before he could deliver his after-action report. 20 minutes. I do not remember those 20 minutes. I remember the after-action report with perfect clarity. But I do not remember the 20 minutes preceding it. The 20 minutes the chaplain's notes insist I spent in visible distress. I have examined this gap carefully. I have tried to locate the emotio. Now memory the way you locate a physical object in a dark room, by systematic approach, by working outward from what you know is there. I know Reese died. I know I was distressed. I know that I valued him, that he had served with me for 3 years, that his competence and his calm had been integral to my own function as a commander. These are facts. The facts are present and ordered. The feeling is absent, not suppressed, not controlled. Absent, as though it was never stored. On the 5th day, Pettick discovered that the main sponson seal on the port side had developed a slow leak. This is the consequence of the hull's angle of inclination, 27 degrees, which places sustained pressure on the lower hull seals beyond their design parameters. The ingress is minimal at present, approximately 0.3 liters per hour. At the current rate of progression, which I cannot calculate precisely without knowing the composition and density of the mire pressing against the hull, we are looking at a period of between 3 and 9 days before the accumulation affects our operational status. I presented this addition to the power budget and life support assessment. I revised our estimates. Patek and Tolf and Kale listened and made their faces do the things faces do when presented with bad numbers, and then Tolf said, "What do we do, Sergeant?" which is what he has always said when I present him with a problem, and which I have always answered with a course of action, a thing to do, a direction for effort. I told them to perform a full inventory of all sealing compounds and emergency patch kits in the hull stores. I told Kale to assess the breathable air reserves and calculate whether they could supplement the scrubber during a partial seal loss. I told Petek to monitor the ingress rate and log it every 30 minutes. I told them these things, and they did them. They are a good crew. I have always been a good crew. Then I sat at my station and performed my own assessment, separately, the assessment I was not going to speak aloud. We have 11 days of power. We have a hull seal that is failing. We have atmospheric conditions that will degrade cognitive function if the scrubber loses efficiency below 80%. We have received no response on the Vox in 5 days. The regimental rally point was 34 kilometers from our last known position. In this terrain, in these conditions, on foot, without atmospheric protection and without knowing the current disposition of the enemy who we were sent here to flank, a dismounted approach would be, at the most optimistic assessment I can generate, suicidal. We are not going to be recovered. I have known this, I think, since the 2nd day. I have been constructing a tactical log that continues to document assessments of our tactical situation and the likelihood of recovery or rescue, because this is what a regimental tactical log contains, and because I am a sergeant of the Cadian Shock Regiments, and a sergeant of the Cadian Shock Regiments does not record the word hopeless in the official documentation. But I am recording it here. Hopeless. I typed the word and waited to feel something about it. The temperature in the hull is 10.7 degrees Celsius. The atmospheric scrubber is running at 91% efficiency. Trooper Kale is recording into his Vox speed in the low light of the secondary lighting system we switched to on day 4 to reduce power draw. The word sits on my log screen and I read it, and I find that I have an intellectual understanding of its implications and nothing else. We are going to die here. This is a fact with no particular emotional coloration. I wonder when that happened. I wonder if it was gradual or sudden. I wonder if there was a moment I could have identified as the moment of departure, if I had been paying attention to the right things, rather than to the power budget and the seal integrity and the atmospheric scrubber efficiency. I wonder if I was always like this. On the 6th day I reviewed my service record. I have always had a copy in the tank's personal terminal, an old habit. Began during my first deployment when I watched a man lose his identity to a traumatic wound that scrambled his cognition, and I thought, I want to know who I was. I accessed it and read it from the beginning. The record describes a consistent performance, commendations for tactical acuity, reprimands, 3 of them early in my career. 1 for unauthorized modification to my tank's main gun elevation system that I believed improved its accuracy and which the records indicate was eventually adopted as a regimental standard. 1 for striking a superior officer whose name the record gives without context and whose behavior I remember without the record's confirmation. And 1 for unauthorized entry into a restricted archive during a deployment to a world whose name is redacted, which I also remember without needing to be reminded. The unauthorized archive entry. I remember this precisely. It was during the deployment the records will not name. The regiment was stationed in the ruins of an administrative complex that had fallen to heretic Astartes 14 months prior and been retaken at enormous cost. The complex's library was still largely intact, protected by some structural quirk that had preserved it while everything around it had burned. I should not have been in it. The complex had been cleared but was considered compromised in ways that the commissariat had not yet fully explained to the regiment's tank crews, who were not considered to have the clearance or the need to know. I had entered at 020 hours using a maintenance access point I had identified during an earlier perimeter inspection. I remember what I found. Not the content. The content I will not record. But I remember standing in the archive for 4 hours reading things by the light of a hand torch. And I remember the experience of reading them as the most vivid I have ever had, that sense of information changing the shape of the world around it as it enters the mind, the particular intellectual vertigo of understanding something that reorganizes everything preceding it. I have felt that sensation twice in my life. Once in that archive, and once, many years later, on the 3rd day in this swamp, when I pressed my palms to the hull of the Iron Patience and felt nothing. The archive was discovered. I was reprimanded. The reprimanded is in the record. The record does not contain what I read. I have spent 31 years applying what I learned in that archive in ways that I cannot directly attribute to it in any report or assessment. I learned in that archive the formal categorization systems by which the Inquisition and the Adeptus Mechanicus classify cognitive deterioration in personnel who have been exposed to certain classes of information or environmental conditions. It is a taxonomy of the mind's failure modes. It has 17 primary categories and 43 subcategories. And the categories are not emotional or psychological in the colloquial sense. They are functional. They describe what a mind stops doing rather than what it starts to feel. I have spent today applying this taxonomy to myself. Category 7 is called dissociative analytical entrenchment in the formal nomenclature, which is the language of mechanist documentation, and which translates, approximately, into common, the retreat of the self into pure function. It is distinguished from other categories by a specific set of symptoms, preserved analytical capacity, progressive loss of affective response, a subjective experience of normalcy, and an objective inability to locate one's own emotional states in memory or present sensation. The subject does not feel sick. The subject does not feel distressed. The subject feels operational. Category 7 is listed as a terminal condition, not in the sense that it kills the body, in the sense that the mind that enters Category 7 does not return from it. The process is, according to the documentation, typically gradual, accelerated by conditions of isolation, sensory monotony, repetitive cognitive tasking, and the absence of novel, emotional stimuli. The documentation notes that subjects in advanced Category 7 frequently become excellent recording devices, precise and comprehensive, and completely divorced from any residual investment in the content they record. I read this and made a note of it in my personal log. Then I closed the file and sat for a long time and tried to locate my response to what I had read. Kale was recording again. The seal was leaking at 0.3 liters per hour. The power cell was bleeding at 0.3 kilowatts per hour. The atmospheric scrubber was running at 91% efficiency. The hull temperature was 10.7 degrees Celsius, and the exterior temperature was, by my estimate, lower still, though the sensors that would have told me precisely had failed on day 2. I opened the file again and read the section on treatment and intervention. The treatment section is 4 sentences long. 3 of them describe conditions that do not apply to a man sealed inside a tank in a swamp. The 4th says, reintegration of the effective response requires novel stimuli and I have high emotional salience delivered in conditions that permit genuine uncertainty of outcome. Novel stimuli of high emotional salience. I looked at the hull around me. The hull that had, 2 days ago, been the iron patient's and was now 97.4 millimeters of ceramite and adamantium at a temperature of 10.7 degrees Celsius. I thought about the Guinness crossing. I thought about Reese. I brought up every detail I had, all of them exact, all of them complete. The temperature and the smoke and the particular flat inflection of his voice. I held them all simultaneously in my mind and waited. Nothing. I thought about Cadia, about the fields and the towers and the particular quality of the light in the early morning. A pale quality of the light in the early morning. A pale quality, the sun never quite managing enthusiasm on Cadia, always a little reluctant, a little reserved, which I had always thought was appropriate. I thought about my mother, who I had last seen when I was 18 years old, and who I had not thought about in, I tried to calculate, 7 years. Perhaps 9. Nothing. I thought about dying here. About the specific nature of it, the oxygen thinning over hours or days as the scrubber failed, or the power ran out, the cold, the dark, the sound of the swamp outside pressing against the hull, the slow sinking of the tank as the mire beneath us shifted and settled. I thought about Patek and Tolth and Kale dying alongside me, about the particular injustice of it. 3 men who had survived everything I had survived, and who deserved better endings than this cold, swamp-bottom obscurity. I thought about the regimental rolls, how our names would be listed. Killed in action, circumstances unknown, bodies unrecovered. I felt the temperature, 10.7 degrees Celsius. I felt the vibration of the failing power cell, a subtle asymmetry in the draw cycle, 0.003 kilowatts per cycle, consistent with the hairline fracture in the coupling. I felt the slight pitch of the hole beneath me, 27 degrees from level, 27 degrees from the world being right. I felt nothing that the taxonomy would not have predicted. Kale found me at my station at what the chronometer calls 0200, though we stopped distinguishing day from night cycles on day 5 when the power budget made the lighting differentiation an unnecessary expenditure. He stood for a moment in the hatch between the hull compartments, and I looked at him, and he looked at me, and then he came and sat on the floor beside my station and did not speak for a time. He is 22 years old. I know this because it is in the crew manifest. He is from a world I cannot now name because the records only give the planetary designation and I have never had the occasion to learn its common name. And his home settlement is listed as Tertiary Agricultural Complex 7. which is not a name either, but a departmental Rome designation for a place that produces food. He has served in the regiment for 4 years, which means he was conscripted at 18, the standard age. His performance assessments note precision, diligence, and what the assessing officer called an excess of sentiment that has not yet interfered with his function. He sat beside my station for a long time without speaking, and then he said, "Sergeant, what do you think happens after?" I told him I did not have sufficient information to make a reliable assessment. He said that was not what he meant. I asked him what he meant. He said, "After this, after we're gone, not where we go, what happens to what we were, whether it matters that we were here." I considered the question. It is not a question I have encountered in my tactical documentation. It has the structure of a question to which there is no operationally relevant answer, and I have historically declined to engage with such questions on the grounds that they consume processing capacity that could be better allocated. But I found that I could not produce a dismissal, not because I had an answer, because I was sitting with the question and finding that something about it engaging me in a way I could not immediately categorize, not the answer, the question itself, the shape of it, the fact that Cale, who had been recording his experiences for days because he wanted whoever found us to know that we had been real people, was asking me this because he was 22 years old, and he was afraid, and he was still, despite everything, real. I said, "I don't know." He nodded. I said, "What do you think?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he thought it mattered that you tried to make it real while you were in it, that you didn't just record what happened, but tried to actually feel what happened, tried to be present in it. He said he thought that was the only thing that persisted, not what you did, but that you were actually there when you did it. I listened to this. I turned it over in the analytical part of my mind, which is, I have to acknowledge, currently the largest part. I looked for the objection, the counter-argument, the operational irrelevance. I found none of these things. I found, instead, something very small and very far away, like a signal in heavy static, like a voice saying a name in the electromagnetic noise of a swamp, something that might have been agreement, or might have been the ghost of a feeling I could no longer fully inhabit, my mind registering the outline of a response it could no longer generate. I told him I thought he might be right. He said he thought the recordings would survive. The tank would survive. Eventually, when the swamp had finished with us. Someone would find her, he said, and they would open her up, and they would find everything we'd left in her, all the logs, all the data, and they would know that we had been here, that we had thought things and felt things and tried to understand what was happening to us. I said, yes. He said good night, or what the chronometer would have called good night, and went back to his station. I sat in the dark for a long time. The hull around me was very quiet. The power cell was bleeding at 0.3 kilowatts per hour. The seal was leaking at 0.3 liters per hour. The atmospheric scrubber was running at 89% efficiency, down from 91, a progression I noted and logged. I pressed my palm against the hull. I pressed it there and held it and waited. On the 7th day, I went through the Iron Patience's history logs, not the tactical logs from my command. The deep history, the accumulated records from every previous crew, stored in the tank's machine spirit archive in the format the Mechanicus uses for long-term data preservation, compressed, layered, accessible but not legible in the way a tactical log is legible. To read it properly, you need the interface codes, which I have, which were given to me when I assumed command along with the tank's ritual maintenance schedules and the particular prayers the previous tech priest had specified for the morning rites. I had logged the interface codes and performed the rites and never accessed the archive itself in 11 years of commanding the Iron Patience, because there was always a more pressing operational priority. There is no more pressing operational priority. The archive goes back 94 years. 11 crews. The earliest entries are in a format that predates some of our current notation standards. Brief, functional, concerned entirely with mechanical status and operational outcomes. They sound exactly like my tactical logs. They are indistinguishable from my tactical logs. Ammunition expended. Range to target. Fuel consumption. Hull temperature. Enemy armor killed. Toward the middle of the archive, there is a period where the entries change character. I believe this corresponds to a deployment on a world I recognize from other sources as Kesrin 7 and the campaign. There that lasted 4 years, which is too long for a single tank crew to maintain the functional distance that good tactical documentation requires. The entries from that period are longer. They describe the crew in terms that are not functionally necessary. They note when the gunner was tired, not as a data point, but as something the writer cared about. There is an entry that is simply a description of the sound of rain on the hull. 11 sentences, no tactical content whatsoever. The entry reads like something Cale would write, like something a person writes who is trying to put into words what it was to be present in a moment. I read the 11 sentences about the rain. I read them twice. I tried to hear the rain. The iron patience is 97.4 millimeters of ceramite and adamantium. Outside her hull, there is black mire. There is no rain. There has not been rain since we entered the swamp. Or if there has been, we could not hear it through the hull. The mire presses too tight against us now for exterior sounds to penetrate. I read the archive through to its most recent previous entry, the final record of the crew before mine, who handed off command of the Iron Patience 11 years ago in a formal transfer ceremony on a world whose name I remember and whose details I will not record here because they are not relevant to this log's purpose, which I am still determining. The final entry from that crew is a crew manifest, a formal list of personnel and their assignments, and at the bottom, in a notation format that is not standard, the previous commander had written, "She has given us 11 years and never failed to bring us home. Whatever home means now. Whatever home means now. Whatever home means now." I sat with those 4 words for a long time. I want to tell you, whoever finds this, whoever opens the Iron Patience, in whatever century you occupy, that I understood those words, that when I add them something happened in me that I could not have charted or catalogued, something that the taxonomy I committed to memory in a forbidden archive does not have a category for, or if it does, I cannot find it. Something that felt briefly and imprecisely and very far away, like recognition. Like a person recognizing another person in a crowd of data. I want to tell you this. I am not certain it is true. Tolf died on the 9th day. It was not dramatic. There was no dramatic version of it available. The atmospheric scrubber had dropped to 81% efficiency by the morning of the 8th day, which placed us inside the margin where the margin gas compounds in the air we were recycling began to accumulate rather than be filtered. The threshold for cognitive impairment is 0.4% concentration. We crossed it somewhere in the middle of the 8th day. By the end of the 8th day, Cale had a headache, and Petek was having difficulty maintaining focus, which I could identify because he kept repeating himself. Not in the way of a man who has forgotten, he has already spoken, but in the way of a man whose mind keeps returning to the same phrase. Because it is the only thing he can hold with certainty. The phrase was, "We should send another Vox signal." He said it 14 times between 1800 and 2400 on the 8th day. I agreed with him each time, and each time Petek would reach for the Vox controls and then stop, because we both knew the power draw, and then a few minutes later he would say it again. I was less affected than the others. I cannot determine whether this is because my physiology processed the compounds differently or because my analytical function is now sufficiently dominant that the impairment simply has less to impair. The taxonomy would have a view on this. I chose not to examine the taxonomy's view. Tolf died in his sleep. I know he was asleep. Beck. I had been monitoring the crew's respiration at irregular intervals since the scrubber efficiency began to drop, noting the rate and regularity of breathing as a proxy indicator for their cognitive state, and his breathing when I last checked it was slow and regular, the breathing of sleep. When I checked again, it had stopped. He was 47 years old. He had survived Vigilus twice, and Fortis IV, and a campaign on a world whose name I know but which is not relevant here. He had been my gunner for 6 years. He was a precise and economical man, economical in speech and in ammunition expenditure, and in the emotional demonstrations that the service tries to regulate out of its tank crews, which are called morale expressions in the documentation, and which are, in reality, the proof that the man inside the machine is still a man and not merely a component. I noted his death in the tactical log. Crew status: 2 operational, 1 incapacitated, 1 deceased. Atmospheric composition: within parameters for life support but approaching threshold for sustained cognitive function. I noted the time, 0312. I noted the cause, respiratory cessation, assumed hypoxic, given ambient conditions. I did not record that he was 47 years old and had survived things that deserved more than a swamp. I am recording it here. Petek sat for a long time with Tolf after I told him. Kale cried again, and this time he did not stop and apologize. He simply cried until he didn't. And then he went back to his station and started recording. I could hear him speaking, but not the words. I thought about going to Petek. I thought about what a person does in that moment, the thing that the situation calls for, the human response to the death of a crewmate. I know what that response looks like. I have seen it. I have performed it, or something that functioned like it, in previous deployments, in previous losses. I sat at my station and I listened to the sounds of a tank grieving. If a tank can grieve, if the people inside a tank can constitute a kind of grief by their accumulated suffering within its hull, and I performed my calculations, and I thought about Tolf, and I recorded the temperature, 10.2 degrees Celsius, and falling. On the 10th day, I found Kale's recordings. He had not protected them. His personal box speed was connected to the tank's internal memory system, an unauthorized modification, but a simple one, and his recordings were stored there, accessible from any of the crew stations. I do not believe he knew this. I believe he thought they were private. I have debated with myself, in the hours since I found him, whether to access them. I have debated whether this debate itself represents something, a residual scruple, a surviving sense that there are things that belong to the person who created them and should not be examined without permission. I accessed them. I want to be honest about this. He had been recording since the 2nd day. The recordings cover, in total, approximately 14 hours of audio. I did not listen to all of them. I listened for 2 hours, which was enough. He talked about his home, Tertiary Agricultural Complex 7. He described it in terms I had not anticipated, not the Departmentum Uniuterum designation, but as a place, a specific place with specific characteristics. The smell of the soil in the growing season, a reddish soil he called iron earth, because of the mineral content, the way it stained your hands for weeks after planting. The sound of the machinery at harvest, the particular tone of the threshers that the children who grew up with that sound found comforting in the way that other people find certain music comforting. A woman whose name I did not catch, his mother or an aunt or a neighbor, who had a way of laughing that he said was the loudest thing in that entire complex, louder than the threshers, louder than the storm alerts, just this enormous laugh that made everyone around her start laughing too, whether they meant to or not. He talked about joining the regiment, about the conscription process, which he did not describe as traumatic, which, he seemed to feel had been, at its essential core, what was supposed to happen to him, the expected next step, the agricultural complex leading to the regiment, the way one season leads to the next. But he talked about the last night before departure, a gathering of the complex's residents in the central hall. Food and something they distilled from the iron earth grain that was not officially classified as alcohol, but functioned as one, and how his face had hurt by the end of it from laughing at things he could not now remember, and how he had walked back to his quarters alone in the dark, and stood outside and looked up at the sky, which was not a sky he recognized any longer because they had been transported to the regimental staging world 3 months prior, and its sky was different star pattern. Different atmospheric composition, giving it a different quality of darkness. And he had thought, I am a long way from home. And then he had thought, I have been a long way from home for 3 months, and I didn't notice until now. He talked about the tank, about the iron patience. He talked about her with the familiarity of a man who has lived inside something for 4 years and developed the specific affection of long cohabitation, the way you come to know a thing's sounds and moods and tolerances in the way you know a person's. He said that she felt to him like a relative, an old, difficult relative, not comfortable, not gentle, but solid in a way that was its own kind of comfort, the comfort of something that had been there before you and would persist after you. He talked about me. He said I was the best commander he had served under, which was 3. He said that I had a quality he struggled to name, something between competence and certainty, that he found reassuring in the way that he found the threshers reassuring, that baseline hum of a thing functioning as it was meant to function. He said that he had sometimes felt, watching me process a tactical situation, that he was watching something beautiful, which he knew was an odd thing to say about analysis, but that there was a kind of beauty in watching a mind move through complexity with that specific efficiency, everything considered, nothing wasted. He said that recently he had become worried about me. He said that he thought something was happening inside me that I might not be fully aware of, and that he didn't know how to talk to me about it. Because talking about what was happening inside yourself seemed to be something I didn't have a format for, and he didn't want to hand me something in a format I couldn't process. He said he hoped that wherever I was in my head, there was still something left that could feel this. He said this swamp, these 10 days, had been the worst of his life, and also, strangely, the most real, the most present he had ever been in his own existence, because when you cannot move, and you cannot escape, and the only thing available to you is your own mind, and the people around you is your own mind, and the people around you, you find out very quickly what you actually are, and he had found out that he was someone who loved things very much, who loved the iron earth smell and the sound of the threshers and the woman's laugh and the crew of the iron patience, and that this love was so large and so present that it actually physically hurt, and that he had decided this pain was the correct condition for a person to be in, that it was, possibly, the definition of being alive. I stopped the recording there. I sat at my station for a long time. Something was happening. I will try to describe it with the precision I apply to everything I record, but I want to say first that precision is inadequate to it, that the gap between the description and the thing being described is, in this case, significant, and that I am noting this gap as a data point, because it is relevant. It was not pain. It was not quite grief. It was not joy. Certainly not. There was nothing in the situation that would produce joy. It was something that the taxonomy does not cover, because the taxonomy is a system for the documentation of functional losses and does not have language for the partial return of what was lost. For the moment when a static signal resolves briefly into something coherent, and you hear very clearly your own name. It was something like waking up, not fully, not in the way I had been awake on the first day, when I pressed my palm to the hull and felt the heartbeat of the machine, but a partial thing, an approximation, a signal that the faculty had not entirely departed, but had been moved to a frequency I had stopped monitoring. I pressed my palm against the hull, cold, 97.4 millimeters of ceramite and adamantium. The temperature, 9.8 degrees Celsius, and then, very faint, very far down in the vibration, something. Not the heartbeat I remembered from the first day, or from the decades before it. Something smaller and slower and more fragile, a frequency that was not mechanical, that did not correspond to any of the systems that should be generating vibration at this level of power reduction, a frequency that I cannot account for by any analytical means available to me. The iron patience was still speaking. I kept my palm there for a long time. Petchek died on the 11th day. I will not write a clinical entry for this. I will write what happened. He had been deteriorating since Tolf, not from the atmosphere, or not only from that. He had been, I think, holding himself together by a specific act of will, the will that experienced soldiers develop as a survival mechanism, and when Tolth died, that act of will became more costly than his reserves could support. He became quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet, which had always been the quiet of a man processing information. This was the quiet of a man withdrawing from the processing entirely. He asked me on the 10th night if I thought the Emperor watched over us. I told him I did not know. He said he had always assumed he did. Not in a formal, devotional way, not in the way the regimental priests meant it, but in a vague, background way, the way you assume the sun will rise. He said that assumption had made things easier. He said he was not sure he could maintain it anymore. I told him I was sorry. This surprised him. He looked at me with an expression I could not immediately categorize, and then he said quietly that he appreciated it. He died before the chronometer reached 0600. Not in his sleep, the way Tolf had. He was awake. He had positioned himself at his driver's station, his hands on the controls even though the engine had been dead for days. And when I found him in the morning, he was sitting there with his hands on the controls and his eyes open and his face turned toward the vision blocks, toward the black mire that was all they showed, as though he had been watching the swamp until the last. Cale and I moved him. We put him beside Tolf in the rear of the hull, which is the closest thing to a proper arrangement we can manage. I said what I could remember of the appropriate words. Cale said more. He spoke to them as though we, still present in some capacity, addressed them directly, told Tolf that he was the best gunner he had seen, and told Petek that he was glad they had driven together. That Petek had a quality of stillness that he had found comforting, that quality of a person who is completely where they are, not somewhere else in their head, just here, just in the tank, just doing the next thing that needs to be done. I stood and listened to Cale, and I found that my mouth was moving, not speaking, but moving the way a mouth moves when it is trying to form words it has not yet found. I let it move. I did not stop it, and I did not force it toward anything articulate. I stood there in the cold dark of the iron patience with my hands at my sides and my mouth moving in the shapes of words I could not produce. And I believe, I am fairly confident that I was feeling something, not the taxonomy's absence, not the clinical observation of the absence, something that was present, something that was in the room with me and Cale and Tolf and Petek, that occupied the space the cold air occupied, that was real in the way that 9.8 degrees Celsius is real and the mire pressing against the hull is real. I did not record it in the tactical log. This is the final entry. I am recording it because Cale asked me to. He is alive as I write this, though his breathing has become labored. The scrubber now running at 73% efficiency, which places us well below the margin where the compounds in the recycled air are doing damage that is accumulating faster than the body can compensate. He is conscious. He is at his station with his Vox bead recording, as he has been since the second day. And he looked at me an hour ago and said, "You should record your last entry, Sergeant, for the log, so they know the whole story." I asked him what the whole story was. He said he didn't know. That was for Army to decide. So, the tactical log, the operational record, is complete. It documents our insertion into the Hessian swamp, our position at time of immobilization, our power budget and its decline, our crew status and its decline, our atmospheric conditions and their decline. It is comprehensive. It is accurate. It will tell whoever opens this tank everything they need to know to file the appropriate casualty returns and close the appropriate operational records. I want this log to tell something different. I was born, I believe, with a capacity for what Cale would call feeling, for what the taxonomy would call affective response, for what the man who pressed his palm against the flank of a chimera at 16 and felt a heartbeat would call communion. I spent 31 years building a mind that could process a battlefield faster than the events on it could move, that could hold power budgets and trajectories and crew status and atmospheric readings simultaneously and extract from that the one right decision. I built it with pride. I believed, and was not wrong to believe, that this mind was the thing that kept the Iron Patience's crew alive through everything that should have killed them. I spent those 31 years not noticing what I was building it from. Cale was right. Something was leaving me. Had been leaving me perhaps for years, perhaps for decades, so slowly that I had no benchmark by which to measure the departure. Only this swamp and the final distance of the hull under my palms, and a boy of 22 years recording the smell of iron earth soil because he was terrified of being forgotten. He has not been forgotten. I want this stated clearly, in this log, in the most direct language available to me. Trooper Sylvain Kale, Loader, Iron Patience, Layman Russ Battle Tank, 14th Armored Company, 1 Desed Bottle Tank, 14th Armored Company, 603rd Cadian Shock Regiment. He was from Tertiary Agrichel, Rahl Complex 7, and the soil there was red with iron, and when they harvested the grain, the threshers made a sound the children found comforting. He loved things very much, and it hurt him, and he decided that the hurt was correct. He recorded everything. He wanted you to know we were real. Trooper Davin Petek, driver, Iron Patience, 41 years old. He had a quality of stillness that I valued without knowing I valued it. He kept his hands on the controls until the end. I think he was watching for the road home. Sergeant First Class Harren Tolf, gunner, Iron Patience, 47 years old. He kept his calm the way a good gunner keeps his fire solutions, under pressure, under duress, at costs the record does not show. He survived Vigilus twice, and I am Sergeant Adlerk Voss, Commander, Iron Patience, and I have been the machine's memory, and I have not always known the difference between recording a life and living one. I know the difference now. I know it the way you know a thing you learned too late, which is clearly and without qualification and with the specific grief of that timing. The power cell will fail within the next 4 to 6 hours. I have managed the draw as effectively as I am able. The atmospheric scrubber will cease to maintain meaningful function shortly after. The cold will come in, which is already here, which has been here since the first day, which is simply 9.8 degrees Celsius and falling. I am going to press my palm against the hull. I am going to sit here in the dark with Kale and with Tolf and Petek in the Iron Patience, which is not iron and not patient, but which has been ours, which we have been hers, which we have been hers, which has carried us further than this swamp, and which will carry us still, in whatever way a machine carries the memory of those who lived inside it, which may be the only form of persistence available to us now. I am going to sit air, and I am going to feel it. The hull is cold. The vibration is very faint, but it is there. I can feel it there, deep in the metal, deep in the thing that we made together over 11 years and 31 years and 94 years, and every crew that pressed their palms here and felt what I feel now and recorded it in the archive where I feel now, could read it in the last days and understand that I was not alone in this, that I was, in fact, in very good company, in the company of everyone who loved this machine, and everyone who found, at the last, that they had been present in their own lives all along, even when they could not feel it, even when the record seemed to say otherwise. I was the machine's memory. And now, at the end, the machine is mine. Whatever home means now. Log EEND. Recording archivsailed. Timestamp. UNC Tain. Iron Patience. 14th Armored Company, 603 RD Cadian Shock Regiment. Emperor protects.